Thank you. I haven't felt so at home since the 60s. I do remember the 60s. There are those that don't, except in flashbacks. You know, the cliche is if you remember the 60s, you weren't there. I am honored to be here at a fest honoring the man who fought against corporate greed at home, imperialism abroad. After Tammy, though, I'm afraid I told Bert I'm going to bore them. 3 years ago, I wrote a book called The War Against America's Public Schools. We weren't actually at war with anybody at the time, but I was very serious about the title. Nothing in the ensuing years has caused me to change my mind. In August, just a few weeks ago, for example, the New York Times carried a front-page article of an analysis finding that kids in charter schools don't do as well as kids in regular public schools. The army that is out to destroy the public schools went ballistic and launched a carpet bombing campaign against both the article and the analysis. Secretary of Education Rod Page defended charters in the Times. The Reverend Floyd Flake, an ardent privatizer, had an op-ed in the Times. Chester Finn, former Assistant Secretary of Education, had an op-ed in the New York Post. J.P. Green of the Manhattan Institute, who has written many pieces pro-voucher, pro-charter, had an op-ed in the New York Post, or New York Sun. 31 right-wing academics, school critics in academia, signed a full-page ad in the New York Times decrying both the analysis and the New York Times article and denigrating the media for having carried it. That ad cost at least $125,000. The enemies of public education are well armed, well organized, and well funded. Since sticking up for public education these days is not something most people cotton to, you're usually either scoffed at or scorned or both. You're told that you're being defensive or self-serving. And given that, I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you how I came to be doing the kinds of things I do, writing the kinds of books I write, like Setting the Record Straight and On the Death of Childhood and the Destruction of Public Schools. It goes back to a specific date, November 4th, 1990. Not usually can you date a life-changing event to a specific day, and I couldn't then. I didn't realize it until about 3 years later. But on November 4th, 1990, the Denver Post reprinted a column by Washington Post columnist Richard Cohen called Johnny's Miserable SATs, which I read over morning coffee. I was working in a school system outside of Denver at the time. It was obvious from reading Cohen's paper that he didn't really understand the SAT, but it caused me to do my own analysis of SAT trends over time, trying to factor out the demographic changes and who's been taking the SAT. The SAT was standardized on 10,654 white kids living in New England. In 1990, we had over 1 million kids, highly diverse, 27% minority, over 50% female, mostly public school kids. That 10,654 kids were mostly private school kids. My analysis found that there really was only a small decline in the SAT verbal score and none at all in the SAT math. And I wrote that up, sent it in to Education Week, which published it under the title, SAT Scores Miserable or Miraculous. And interesting things started to happen. Other people started sending me other data that showed the same kind of thing that I had found for the SAT. And most curious of all was a phone call I got one day from some engineers at Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque. And I thought it was curious because when I thought of Sandia, if I thought of Sandia at all, I thought of it in terms of hydrogen bombs going off, because that's what they did down there. They made the plutonium triggers for hydrogen bombs. But apparently, Secretary of Energy Watkins, Energy Funds Sandia, had come through and said, education will be a priority at Sandia. And the impression I got was these engineers looked at each other and said, huh? But being engineers, and systems engineers at that, they decided that they would study the system they were being asked to give priority to. And they had produced a 156-page report, and they wanted to share it with me, and since they were coming up to Denver anyway, they did. And I gave them all the stuff I had. They showed me all of the stuff they had, and when it was all over, I said, let's put all this together and publish it somewhere, preferably in the popular press, because if we publish it in an educational journal, we'll just be putting numbers on what educators already believe. And they said, we can't. So we are entombed in internal politics. And they told me of how they had gone to Washington and presented their findings to the Department of Energy, Department of Education, and some congressional staffers. And at the end, David Kearns, then the Deputy Secretary of Education, former CEO of Xerox, had looked at them and said, you bury this, or I'll bury you. And that was just astonishing to me that the government, the Department of Education, would try to suppress a report, which after all was not wholly positive about the state of the schools. In fact, the last sentence of the report read, there are many serious problems in U.S. public education, but there is no system-wide crisis. That was too positive for the Bush administration, for the Department of Education. And so the report was suppressed. It didn't get published until Clinton came in, and it was published in the Journal of Education Research, where it was probably seen by maybe 5,000 people, if that. But having said they couldn't join me in a publishing venture, they said, we don't own this data. We've done some original analyses for Albuquerque and New Mexico, but most of the stuff we got from the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and especially the U.S. Department of Education. It's already public domain. You can have the data and run with it. We don't have to see our names on an article. And so that's what I did. I tried to run to Harper's and the Atlantic Monthly and Esquire, and they weren't having any. I think I was seriously considering running to Playboy with it. But I fell back on Phi Delta Kappa, which is a very well-respected education monthly, and I wrote an article called Why Can't They Be Like We Were?, which is my first attempt to distill this terribly misguided nostalgia that there once was a golden age of American public education where everyone learned. Some of you may recognize that as a snippet of a lyric from a 1960 musical, Bye Bye Birdie. And don't worry, I don't sing, but it goes, why can't they be like we were, perfect in every way, or what's the matter with kids today? The point of the story was that I had not set out to defend public schools. I hadn't started with an ideology of support. I'm a research psychologist by formal training, and that training greatly impressed upon me the importance of using data whenever you can to support a decision. And all of the data in the Sandia report and a report from ETS called Performance at the Top and some others had simply compelled the conclusion that American schools were doing much better than the critics claim, and that a nation at risk was, in fact, a lie. Why Can't They Be Like We Were appeared in October 1991, and shortly after that, more data started coming my way. In early 1992, there was an international study of math and science. Our scores were about average, but the ranks were low, and so you could use the ranks to bash the schools, and people did that. The headline in Newsweek was an F in world competition. By the way, a digression concerning competition. Although you hear all the time that we have to raise our educational standards in order to compete in the global marketplace, there is, in fact, very little connection between what happens in K-12 education and global competitiveness, at least among developed nations. That there is a connection was codified in A Nation at Risk. That document contended that the threat to our nation was not so much that our enemies would blow us off the globe as it was that our friends, especially Germany, Japan, and South Korea, would outsmart us and take away our markets. The authors of A Nation at Risk wrote, quote, "If only to keep and improve on the slim competitive edge we still retain in world markets, we must dedicate ourselves to the reform of our educational system." The people who wrote A Nation at Risk looked at Germany and Japan and South Korea, and they saw high test scores and booming economies. And then they made the logically erroneous causal inference that the high test scores caused the economies to boom. This theory became very popular as we slid into the recession that would cost George I his second term. We heard many variations back then of lousy schools are producing a lousy workforce, and that's killing us in the global marketplace. In fact, all during this period, the American worker was the most productive in the world. Former Secretary of Labor Ray Marshall and Mark Tucker of the National Center on Education and the Economy wrote a book, Thinking for a Living. In that book, they called Japan and Germany, quote, economic juggernauts, and, quote, the twin colossi of the world, of the world economy. One can only hope that today they are horribly embarrassed by those words, because by late 1993, American media were running headlines like, "The American economy back on top" in the New York Times, "Rising Sun meets Rising Sam" in the Washington Post. "America cranks it up" on the cover of Business Week. We had started what would become the largest sustained economic expansion in the history of the country. Had the schools improved? Were they responsible for the economic turnaround? Not according to the critics. 3 months after that New York Times headline, "The American economy back on top," IBM CEO Lou Gerstner, who might also be called the CEO of corporate school bashers, took to the op-ed page of the Times with an essay, "Our schools are failing." And why were they failing? They're failing because American kids couldn't compete with their European and Asian peers on tests of math and science, and therefore our economy was doomed too. In 1994, when Gerstner wrote his piece, our test scores were still average, Japan's were still near the top. But, to repeat, test scores don't count for very much in the way of a nation's economic health. From 1991 to 2003, Japan was either in recession or stagnant. It enjoyed 3 good quarters of growth in 1993 and in the first quarter of 1994, but now it's stagnant again, and people wonder if it will ever break out of and be a powerful economy again. In the mid-1990s, you might recall those so-called Asian tiger nations' economies tanked. And in 2001, Singapore, which usually stomps the bejesus out of everybody else on these tests, declared that it was in recession. And in the meantime, our middling test scores were not preventing our economy from booming. The most highly regarded rankings on global competitiveness come from the Global Competitiveness Report, which issues forth each year from the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. And that report usually ranks us as number 1. In the most recent report, we dropped to number 2 among the 80 countries it ranks, but schools had nothing to do with that. The WEF didn't like the Bush tax cuts, didn't like the budget deficit, and especially didn't like our ever-increasing trade deficit. Its corruption index, which is one of the many factors that go into the rating, was put off by the seemingly endless parade of CEOs and Wall Street brokers on their way to being indicted. There's a new report coming out October 15th. You might want to watch for it. Meanwhile, the next time you hear that we've got to get our test scores up in order to compete economically with other nations, know that you are being scammed. And you will hear it. On September 13th, just 5 days ago, Secretary of Education Rod Page, reacting to a study that found American scores once again in the middle of a pack compared to 27 other developed nations, said, quote, "If we are less competitive educationally, we will soon become less competitive economically. It's a scam. It's a scam to control education and to control you, to control people by making you anxious about the future. Corporate America has been trying to control public education for over a century, and they're trying even harder currently. Now, once you finish reading my books, Setting the Record Straight and On the Death of Childhood, I suggest you pick up Kathy Emery and Susan Ohanian's Why is Corporate America Bashing Our Public Schools? It's a devastating book, and the fingerprints of the Business Roundtable, and especially of Ed Rust, the CEO of State Farm Mutual, a company so morally bankrupt it was sued by its own lawyers for forcing them to commit unethical acts. The Business Roundtable's fingerprints are all over this push for higher standards and a one-size-fits-all educational system. End of digression. It's longer than I thought it was going to be. When I left off the main thrust, I had more data pouring into my office, and in the spring of 1992, I suggested to the editors that we do a follow-up, and they said, fine, and I sent in a follow-up with the title, The True Crisis in Public Education Today, and a Post-it note on page 1 saying I wasn't happy with the title and I wanted the editors to come up with something zippy. Well, Phi Delta Kappan is published down in Bloomington, Indiana, and any Badger fan will know that they don't do zippy in Bloomington, Indiana. I taught at Bloomington, at IU Bloomington, and when we wanted a dose of zippiness, we came up to Madison, which was then known as Berkeley East. Anyway, the zippy title that the editors applied was the second Bracey Report on the Condition of Public Education, and they wanted it to be an annual event, the 14th, I can't believe I've been doing this now for 14 years, the 14th Bracey Report will appear in 2 weeks. Again, the point is, I never set out to defend schools. I was compelled by the data. Looking at the data, I drew the conclusion that anyone looking at the data would draw unless you had some anti-school ideology or bias to start with. So, why are corporate America and politicians and right-wing think tanks like the Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee and so many others bashing our school? What is the motive? By the way, the Bradley Foundation spends about $5 million a year on education. You might go to their website, www.bradleyfdn.org, and take a look at who gets it. It ain't me, babe. As for motive, some people look at the roughly $450 billion we spend annually on K-12 public education and just say, I want some. Public education is by far the largest existing market that is largely untapped by the private sector, although the Wall Street Journal estimates that No Child Left Behind is already worth $25 billion to the corporate America. The two largest educational management organizations, the now bankrupt and defunct Tesseract Group and the still struggling Edison Schools, were both out just to turn a buck. Edison's founder, Chris Whittle, did pitch a lot of hype about the educational revolution his schools would bring, and for free, he said it wouldn't cost any more than the regular public spend. But he's failed to improve the achievement of the kids in his schools, and he's had to admit that his model costs $1,500 to $2,000 more per kid than the average public school spends. And here's an irony. Whittle took Edison public, and then last year he decided to take it private again. Who bought it? Jeb Bush. Jeb Whittle, in its 12 years of existence, has turned a quarterly profit exactly once. Jeb Bush bought it as an investment for the Florida retirement system. Who's in the Florida retirement system? 50% of the people in it are retired public school educators, teachers. They now have partial dependence on a company whose goal was to destroy public education. There's an irony. Bill, bingo was my gateway drug, Bennett, is also in the, I have to think about that one for a minute, schools for a profit game. His latest gamble, K-12 Incorporated, which is operating in Wisconsin, ought to be making a bundle since they get a lot of money per kid. They have no buildings to build or maintain, no kids to transport or feed, and parents do most of the teaching. For those parents who are not part of a virtual school, K-12 rents computers for $1,200 a year. You could buy the same computer from Dell or Gateway or Best Buy for $500. They rent it for $1,200. As for motive, again, some acolytes worshiping at the feet of Milton Friedman truly believe that a private system would be a better system. Instead of giving money to the schools, they would have us give the money to the parents in the form of vouchers, and the parents could then choose where to send their kids to school. The theory behind this is expressed very simply and simplistically. Good schools will prosper, bad schools will go out of business. The reality is much more complicated. And none of these people seem to think about what will happen to the kids when these bad, so-called bad schools go out of business. This year, 2 weeks before schools open, a California charter school operation under investigation for mismanaging funds and breaking laws closed its doors of 60 campuses, which threw 10,000 kids out of school on the street with no school to go to 2 weeks before school opened. 2,300 ended up in other charters, and I assume the rest were taken in by the public schools who must take them in. Kids shouldn't be subject to such caprice. Of course, teachers and principals in those schools were worse off since the regular schools were already staffed for the coming year. Some people on the religious right would love to have a voucher system that supported private schools. Then they could teach religion without having to worry about that finicky, bothersome old First Amendment that separates church and state. The Catholic Church has been quite discreet about its role in such a system to date, but not anymore. Since the Zellman decision last year, which declared that the voucher program in Cleveland meets constitutional muster, they've been very actively recruiting and lobbying for vouchers. In Cleveland, 96% of the kids who use vouchers go to religious schools, and 67% of them go to Catholic schools. This year, when Bush was stumping for George II, was trying to get a voucher program into Washington, D.C., he made his biggest pitch in a White House speech to 350 members of the Catholic Education Association in town for a conference. Some might see that as a blatant attempt to buy the Catholic vote in November. To me, a privatized system would be a disaster, despite claims of the privatizers that public schools are unresponsive because they are a monopoly. And in fact, sometimes they don't call them public schools, they call them government schools, with a socialistic implication. But actually, studies have found that public schools are more responsive to parental input than are private schools. And that's the point. When the schools are public, we have public discussions about what they ought to be doing, what they ought to teach, and how. Under a privatized system, those discussions would cease. Education ceases to be a public good and a public responsibility. It becomes a transaction of citizens of a community. It becomes just another commercial transaction, no different than buying a Big Mac. And that brings me to George Bush's signature education law, No Child Left Behind, which is a major vehicle to bring about just the kind of privatization that I've railed against. Now, I know that that was a bipartisan bill, and it was championed by liberals like Teddy Kennedy and George Miller of California, but I have to tell you, I think they got snookered. I presented my arguments that No Child Left Behind is a bill to privatize the system, sent them by email to both offices and also by snail mail. From Kennedy's office, I got absolutely nothing. From Miller, I got an email from a staffer saying, in toto, I certainly hope not. Not a particularly sophisticated response. But from the perspective of George II and Karl Rove, and especially Grover Norquist, No Child Left Behind must look like the perfect law. And in fact, that's the title of an article I wrote that will appear in the fall issue of Dissent magazine that's out in a couple of weeks. It's the perfect law, as in the perfect storm, incomparable in its ability to wreak havoc. No Child Left Behind has the potential to shift large amounts of money that we spend on public education into the private sector. And that in turn would reduce the size of government. Norquist especially would love to see that. Grover Norquist is a very colorful man. You may recall him as the person who said, I don't want to do away with government, I just want to shrink it to the size where I can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the tub. He also said bipartisanship is another word for date rape. But when Bush came in, one of his first acts was to try and outsource 750,000 federal jobs to private corporations. Right now we have a war going on where soldiers are doing most, but not all, of the shooting, but Halliburton is doing everything else. One subsidiary of Halliburton, KBR, has over 20,000 people on the ground in Iraq. So they're trying in various ways to reduce the size of government. To understand what's going on, you have to do two things. The first is to remember that old anti-rape t-shirt that said, what part of no don't you understand? When it comes to George Bush, the answer is either none of it or all of it. He doesn't understand any of it. He does not take no. He does not process no for an answer when he wants something. You also have to go back, the second thing you have to do is go back to the 2000 election. In that election, voucher referenda in California and Michigan went down in flames 70-30 in both states, despite the fact that the voucher advocates spent twice as much as the voucher opponents. Most voucher advocates at that point distanced themselves from vouchers. Bush did not. He does not process no. His first No Child Left Behind plan in early 2001 contained a voucher proposal. Any school that failed to make adequate yearly progress, which is a technical term in the law, for 3 years in a row would be entitled, the students would be entitled to vouchers. Congress said no. It also said no to a half dozen voucher amendments that were offered on Bush's behalf by John Boehner of Ohio. Bush, though, not processing no, brought in a separate plan for vouchers in a half dozen cities at a cost of $75 million a year. Congress stripped it to one city, the District of Columbia, and said no. It blocked it for 4 separate votes. At that point, Bush operatives detached the plan from the DC budget bill and inserted it into a $328 billion omnibus spending bill. And many Democrats just felt there was too much money at risk to just keep vouchers out of the district, and that bill passed. If Bush wins in November, vouchers are going to be back big time. He does not process no. As noted, the defeat of voucher referenda in California and Michigan cooled most voucher advocates' ardor. They also those referenda sent the message that the citizens were satisfied with their public schools. To make vouchers acceptable for the middle class, some mechanism had to be found that would drive a wedge between people and their schools, to make them unhappy with their schools. That wedge is called adequate yearly progress, or AYP. All schools must make adequate yearly progress until the witching year of 2014, when 100% of all students must be, the law mandates 100% of all students must be proficient in reading, math, and science, however a state defines proficient. And not only does the school have to make AYP, all subgroups in the school have to make AYP. In many schools, that means 37 categories of kids must pass. If your special ed kids fail to make AYP, the whole school fails. If your English language learners fail to make AYP, the whole school fails. If 95% of any group doesn't show up on test day to bubble in answer sheets, the whole school fails. Obviously, this is a reform in the great tradition of the beatings will continue until morale improves. By the way, the law uses a phrase, scientifically based research, 111 times, yet there is no research base whatsoever to support NCLB as a program. In fact, no educator or psychologist would ever design a program like No Child Left Behind and expect it to work. The provisions are stringent. California projects that by the year 2014, 99% of its schools will be failing. Minnesota, one of the highest scoring states in the nation, projects 80%. I couldn't find anybody either at DPI or at the university in Madison who knows what it is for Wisconsin. In fact, one friend said, it doesn't sound like the kind of thing that analysis that the state would joyfully do. The federal program is much more stringent than any state program, and one of the things that has happened is states will pass, or schools will pass the state program and fail the federal program, and that sows confusion. And that's, I think, is planned. A couple of weeks ago, the New York Times Sam Dillon cataloged this problem in an article, Good Schools Are Bad, Ratings Baffle Parents. Dillon reported that while 2/3 of Florida's schools were high performing under Jeb Bush's accountability system, 3/4 of them failed under George Bush's accountability system, which must have made for interesting dinner conversation at Kennebunkport that summer. Parents worry that the failing label will cause colleges to look down on their graduates. And one said in Dillon's article, did Congress consider what labeling a school a failure would do to property values? Now that might be the start of a revolution. Now it's madness, but it's madness with a purpose, namely to disenchant people who were previously satisfied with their schools. It creates dissonance. It's the wedge. One might hope that school officials, how many of you in this audience say you think you know somewhat or a lot about No Child Left Behind? It's not a majority by any means. In the recent Phi Delta Kappa and Gallup poll that was released this month, 68% of parents said they knew little or nothing about No Child Left Behind. If you make people doubt the value of their car or their investment or their public schools, you have increased your chances of selling them something else. No Child Left Behind and AYP combine to create doubt about the value of public schools, increasing the probability, the administration hopes, of selling people on vouchers. You must be on guard against the forces arrayed against the public schools. If Bush wins in November, we have to push the alert up to code red. Public education is truly at risk. Thank you.